Hey everyone. Today we'll talk about the future of food and how innovation is the key to sustainable food production and development. Welcome to Invincible Innovation Live. I'm so glad that you're here with me. I'm Mazor, Kario, innovation and value creation expert, and I'll be your host. And my guest today is Brett Wiskar. Hey Brett, great to see
Hey Andy,
you.
how are you?
Good. And Brett is the
Excellent.
Chief Future Officer at Wiley. So happy
That's
to be
correct.
that you're with us. We're live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, and you're much invited to join the discussion and ask questions. Now we can start. Most leaders are not satisfied with their innovation results. So how could companies innovate better?
That's a very open question, and I guess the challenge around innovation is more around the thinking behind it and getting the psychology of people in your organisation to start to focus on areas that can undergo improvement. So, very few organisations or supply chains or industries are geared up for constant change, and yet that's the one thing that is a constant. And so what most organisations struggle with in innovation is the fact that very few people come to work every day hoping that today will be different from yesterday.
I guess.
They're just hoping that they can get through yesterday's to-do list and the things that they didn't get done. So that really, I guess, in the last sort of 15 or 20 years has really spawned an innovation industry. And you're someone that spends a lot of time in the innovation industry across a lot of different geographic regions, but also across a lot of different industries. And really the reason that innovation industry exists is because most people emotionally and psychologically are designed to not disrupt and change how a mechanism works, but actually to perform a role within that mechanism, and that gives them some psychological security and some predictability about how they earn a living or how they spend their time, and that's why there is a whole school of innovators and disruptors and design-led thinking and all of these, adoption programs and investment in innovation by corporates and governments to try to bring about the change that is going to positively impact the world and our industries. And I guess that's kind of the industry that I play in and that you play in.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your title, Chief Future Officer. So it's an unusual title. So what does that really say for people when you come and explain what you're doing?
So maybe to give you some context about where that came from, Wiley as an organisation works in a few different industries, but one of our major revenue sources is in the food sector in Australia, New Zealand, and the Asia Pac area. And a lot of the work that we do is around large organisations that manufacture or produce or process food. And it's around the design of how they go about that, how they build their facilities, process that food, do it safely, maintain hygiene, distribute the product. And the thing about our food industries globally is that they are absolutely enormous revenue generators. And I think a lot of people around the world, particularly in first world countries where they're quite detached from where food is produced, have no idea of the billions and billions and billions of dollars that is turned over by food businesses day in and day out in the cities and towns that we live in, and the engine behind that is the production of that raw material. So that's where Wiley plays. And the role came about in that I spent a lot of time looking at robotics and artificial intelligence and energy solutions and environmental sustainability and those kind of things. And what we found was that there was really a need for us to, when our clients would come to us and say, I want to expand my operation by 20% in 2 years' time, and we do some maths and say, okay, well, that's a $50 million piece of expenditure. What we found that is a lot of people were saying, well, that facility is going to last us for 15 years before we have to expand it again. And we'd say, what do you think your industry will look like in 15 years? And they would kind of look at you wondering why you'd ask the question. Because a lot of people were choosing the investment that they wanted to make around the business as they understood it today, not the business that they were going to be in 15 years' time. And if they had a competitor who was going to disrupt the industry by changing how that product was produced or distributed or grown or processed or something, then they might have spent $50 million expecting to get 15 years out of it, but they might only get 2 years out of it before they have to change or upgrade or modernize or automate. And so the role really came about in terms of just talking within industry and within our client base and within industry bodies about what the future of industry would look like, and trying to raise the level of conversation that people were prepared to have, and not necessarily, nobody can tell you exactly what the industry will look like in 15 years, but it's more about asking questions that people hadn't thought they should probably ask themselves before setting off on those kind of journeys. So yeah, I think I've had that total for about 3 years, and it does spark really interesting conversations. And someone asks you in an elevator what you do, and you say you're Chief Future Officer, they look at you quite strangely. And my children have a very different view of what I do for a living from what I probably actually do. And but it is a conversation starter, but it does also cause our clients to kind of say, well, how long since we did have a proper look at what the future of our industry might look like, or how much we invest in innovation, or, there's a range of different sort of key question starters that the conversation elicits. And some clients think they've got a handle on it, and some clients say, I can't wait to have you come and talk to us about how that might, how our industry might work, because they understand what they don't know. And so that's, it's a wonderful role. I get to spend a lot of time talking to a lot of people in a lot of different businesses and industries about the future of their business. And I find it, outstanding, very fulfilling.
Yeah, it sounds great, because most people, when they think about innovation, they are not thinking exactly about de-risking their business, but this is exactly what you offer them. You're saying, like, you're investing such a large amount of money, and you want to make sure that you will get the revenues for the next 15, 20 years from now, because this is how you base your business model. And if you might be wrong, in 5 years, maybe it will be different. It's really risky.
Yeah, and if they're going to their board or their CFO to ask for $50 million or $20 million, invariably there's some kind of business case validation, and the business case is can we produce more of the product? Can we produce 30% more, because that's worth X million dollars a year to our bottom line? And a lot of it is maths based around extrapolating known profit margins or economies of scale or efficiency of production, but very few people kind of go, will this industry exist in 10 years' time? Or, currently for every 15 tons of product we produce, we have 3 staff. Might that change? And in 20 years' time, it might be, triple that output from half the number of staff. But also our cost of staff will change dramatically, because we're going to need a whole bunch of roboticists or electrical engineers, where previously we needed physical manual labor. So I think when companies are putting together business models, they really sort of they look at revenue and short-term revenue, but they don't necessarily look at disruptive influences of shifts in production from manual labor to thought work and intelligence workers and those kinds of things.
So you mentioned robotics and AI. So what would be the opportunities for disruptive tech in the food sector?
That's a really good question, and it's a question that I pose to people quite frequently. The challenge there is a lot of, if I talk to people in a lot of industries about innovation, and take robotics as a really good example, if we say sort of what robotics is going to come, and if we go to trade shows targeted at the food industry, there's a lot of what they call AGVs, automated guided vehicles, and you're talking about something not much bigger than an office chair, or it might be 300 millimeters tall and have the area of a small coffee table, but it can drive itself around, and it can avoid collisions, and it can pick up product and move it from A to B and those kinds of things. And people see that and they kind of go, I can see there's a role in my facility that's going to be replaced by that, or we're going to improve the safety of our staff because they don't have to pick up heavy things. But I think so if I ask that question, people can tell you what today's robotics will do to their business if their budget tripled and they were given a brief to adopt some robotics next year. So very frequently people can tell you what 2 or 3 years from now looks like. And if you ask them then, what does robotic innovation look like after that? They kind of look back at you and go, I'm not sure I understand the question. because they think that they've then at that point adopted robotics and the journey's over. So to give you an example, in the red meat sector where Wiley does a lot of work, there's some global technology suppliers that make things called ASRS, or an automated shuttle and retrieval system. And if you can imagine a cold storage warehouse that has inside it a roller coaster for cardboard boxes full of food, where effectively the food is produced and a cardboard box is slid into this cold storage facility on a set of rollers on a conveyor belt, and it disappears. And essentially, through a series of gates and pneumatic levers and conveyors, that box is filed in this enormous refrigerated filing cabinet. And at some point in time, when that box is required to fulfill an order is submitted to a computer control system, and that box and a range of other boxes to fulfill an order are all spat out a door, and they arrive and are stacked on a pallet and put on a truck and taken away. Now, 10 years ago, those systems were in their infancy, and that role was filled by very large, strong men, guys who were 6'6" in the old scale and 130 kilos, who were wearing thermally insulated suits, and they carried 40-kilo boxes around all day, every day. And red meat processing facilities around the world employed dozens, if not hundreds, of these people. But they were operating in a room that was at 7 degrees. They had a particularly unpleasant job. It was very physically challenging. There was a high turnover of those stuff. Well, now that can be done by a robotic system. The question then becomes, that's a very low-skilled job that can be replaced. And it's not a stranger to you or your audiences that what we're going to see in the next generation is increasingly more sophisticated skills start to be more impacted by robotics. But when I do talk to people about robotics, there is kind of that generic fear that all of our jobs will be taken. But people need to think about their jobs not as a job, but a series of tasks. And if you do 10 tasks in a job and there are 10 people in your organization who do those 10 tasks, 3 of those tasks might be replaced by robots, and 3 of those tasks might never in a million years be replaced by robots. And 4 of the tasks in the middle will be best done by robots and people working together. And so what we're going to find is robots are going to disrupt how jobs are done, but not necessarily eliminate all of the jobs. So if your job is moving heavy cardboard boxes around, then a robot's going to take your job, and quicker than you think. However, if your job is doing subjective assessment on the quality of a product, or working with the labour force to strategize how to best use our resources, then there are computer systems and robotic systems that are going to help you do those jobs better. But they're still going to need a degree of subjective skill for people to play in that sort of space. And in red meat or other food processing, there is always, for the foreseeable future and probably decades, there is a role in a red meat facility for somebody who holds a knife, who cuts product and trims waste and does sort of value-adding activities. And a lot of those value-adding activities are nuanced and require opposable thumbs at this point. I'm not saying they won't be done by robotics, but the journey to robots performing some of those tasks is probably very long. Yeah.
When we discussed this last time, we discussed about the future of red meat industry and animal products in general. And it seems that in some cases, people prefer to re-examine if they want to use these products or not. And as a vegan, for me to hear like it's a product, it's really hard for me because it's an animal. And just imagine that right now these people they need to handle animals. And once it will be with robotics, it will be, so much easier in the sense, right? Like it's going to be faster even.
Yeah, and there is across all food, there are a range of different moral and ethical dilemmas around all sorts of sort of the origin and the sourcing of food, but also the mix of food in Western countries and in developing nations, and developing nations don't necessarily have access to the sophisticated systems that the Western nations have in terms of food production. And so really sort of the food landscape globally is going to change. And I think, there is a very much not just an ethical component to how future generations are going to make those decisions, but there's also a sustainable element to that, in that a lot of motivation for people eating less red meat in the last 2 decades has been around sort of heart disease, and then increasingly it's about animal welfare. But probably the next tranche of people around the globe that are going to reconsider where they get their protein from are probably people who are concerned about environmental considerations or water consumption. Food processing across the board is astonishingly energy and water intensive. Sterilization of equipment and food environments is frequently done with steam, which is, costly to produce from an energy perspective and also costly from a water consumption perspective. And then you end up with a lot of wastewater that has a lot of food product in it that needs to be treated, and that's energy intensive. So there are a lot of, I said before, a lot of people don't realize the billions and billions and billions of dollars that goes on around in the food industry. I think people have a very poor perception of the energy and water demands that the industry has. And then, as we touched on, the nature of livestock across the board is a tricky area for people in the food industry as well.
Yeah. Why do you think that people are less aware of the numbers in their food? Because it's like it makes sense. We have lots of people; they are all eating each day. So why are they less aware of that?
Yeah, I think there is a transactional component to that. I think there's also, we talked psychologically about people's inability to change around innovation earlier. I think psychologically, a lot of people are very focused on not looking directly at where their food comes from. I think there is a self-preservation aspect to that, in that if they were armed with a lot of information about food, they might need to make some different decisions or come to terms with the nature of how they arrive at their food. And so, I think that's increasingly information's more and more available, and there are some agendas being driven around the world in that topic. But without a question, the number of chickens and the number of cows and pigs and sheep that exist on the planet purely come into existence for the creation of food value is undeniable. And I know many people who will sit down happily with me and share a steak at a restaurant, but not necessarily want to talk about where it came from. And I think that's the same, in a whole bunch of areas. But even in non-controversial areas, the food industry can be an industry that is confronting in terms of for us to produce the volume of food we do globally on the scale that we do at the price point that we do. There has to be some really tremendously industrial farming activities that take place, and that doesn't necessarily sit well with people in terms of its impact on the environment and the traditionally or for the last sort of 60 or 70 years, the nature of fertilizer and how the soil is treated and how erosion evolves around that. So we are sort of getting to an era where, sustainability across the board is a concern for a lot of people, and they're starting to gain access to thinking and insights into where this food comes from. And we see in our client base, retailers across the globe are getting questioned by their consumer to say, well, where did this product come from? How sustainably was it produced? What's its impact on the land or the water or the energy? And the retailers are then passing those concerns on to the food processors, and they're saying, okay, well, I'm prepared to sign a 5-year contract with you that says I'll buy this much product from you at this price with this degree of certainty, but you need to be cleaner and greener, and I would need to audit your facility or audit your supply chain and get visibility on that, because the consumer is essentially asking the retailer for it. And the retailers across the board are astonishingly powerful. In the UK context, Tesco and Sainsbury's, or in France, Carrefour, in Australia, it's Coles and Woolworths. And, those retail chains have literally billions of customers every day who are walking in their doors, and it is a habitual spend, and the consumers can't get away from it. So the retailers are very powerful at convincing the food process supply chain to raise their game. And And they're also not saying, look, I want you to produce this sustainably, but I'm also going to pay you 20% more for it. They're saying, if you want me to buy from you, I want you to produce it sustainably. And so the food industry across the globe is starting to have to clean up its game, to look at those who are dragging the industry back, and they'll be left behind by the retailers. And like all industries, there are sort of some early adopters and some innovative thinkers, and they're going to aggressively pursue those retailers to say, well, I've got a very clean product, I've got a very clean environmental or energy solution or water solution, or my animal welfare solution is at a premium. So, you should buy from me, and those organizations are going to benefit from being ahead of the curve, and the retailers are going to appreciate that, and they're going to share that information with the consumers. So the dollar power, the spend power of the consumers has an ability to change this, and change it quite quickly, quite dramatically. I talk to people in Australia, you could drink out of plastic straws at the start of 2019, and by about August that year, you were a pariah in the public if you chose to drink out of a plastic straw, because all of a sudden in the consumer's mind, it was realised that plastic straws ended up in the ocean and turtles died, and nobody in Australia will hand you a plastic straw these days. So, that changed in a matter of months, and some of this stuff around environmental sustainability, the food supply chain, can change just as quickly.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that when we think about change, and it's funny that in any case that I talk to people about change, it's always like back to the people and how they see themselves and how they see their lives, and what are the decisions based on that. And people do change, even if in most cases they don't want to, once they see things differently. And, right now we're in the middle of the COVID crisis, which is like a very big change for most people in the globe, not in Australia maybe, but for all the other countries. So what do you think are the challenges the innovation leader are facing right now?
I think understanding market drivers. So to that point before about, the retailers or the consumers pressuring the retailers, pressuring the supply chain, innovation for innovation's sake is really a good idea. Innovation to open up new markets is a really powerful strategy, but also particularly challenging. A straight line to a return on investment from innovation is, how do I innovate what I already do to do it slightly cheaper and slightly faster or slightly cleaner? And, quite frequently that tends to be sort of an internal innovation effect. You take a subject matter expert in a business and say, our business does 10 things, which ones can we improve on? And let's break them down and look at them granularly to determine where we can make some improvements. If organizations want to look more broadly at that and say, how do I shift the needle for an industry or for our business, for our sector, then that tends to be something that requires a different kind of thinking. And quite frequently the people in those businesses and the subject matter experts may well be the worst people to have involved, because their view of that industry is so tainted by their preceding 20 years of experience and their learned behaviours about where value comes from. I think that's where you see design-led thinking, multidisciplinary teams tends to have phenomenal impact from an innovation perspective. The ability to kind of go, well, I'm going to take someone from HR and someone from legal and someone from manufacturing and 3 external consultants who know the supply chain, and I'm going to have it facilitated by an innovation leader. Those things tend to break the shackles a little bit. And some innovation cultures within organizations are better equipped to do it themselves and some are not. I do know of a corporate in Australia that has a process where they run innovation idea capturing activities in their business, and then when they see something that looks like it's got potential, they might take the person responsible from the IT and 2 or 3 others, and they'll take them out of the business. And they go and put them in a startup incubator somewhere else, and they'll fund them. And the reason they do that is because they understand, and I was talking to someone from this company, and he said they understand that their antibodies, being the existing culture of doing the thing they do for a living, will kill that idea. And you've got to take that idea and put it somewhere else and let it grow up. And when it's kind of a teenage idea and a little bit angst-filled and a little bit prepared to be disruptive, then you can bring it back in and put all of the energy of the corporation and the system of the corporations behind it to grow it. But if you let it be an infant in that organisation, a lot of people who derive a lot of their personal self-esteem from doing things the way things are already done then find themselves to be an anti-sponsor for that idea and are trying to find ways to kill it. So I think that, you know, there are some strategies and some cultural ways that you can go about building that out. But the important thing is understanding that you need to change. You know, you need to be an organization, whether there's 5 people or 5,000 people or 50,000 people in a company. You need to have a program where you say, if we're this same organization 3 years from now, we're in trouble. So, you know, budgetarily and culturally and from a labor resource perspective, how much can we afford to experiment? You know, and there is sort of an innovation model around exploitation and exploration. And exploitation is we've got this many clients and this much product and this much staff and this many premises. And, you know, this is our IP and we're going to exploit that to make as much money as we possibly can. We also need to be exploring because, you know, the world is littered with organizations that were massive that don't exist anymore because they were exploiting dramatically but not doing any exploration.
Yeah, it seems that the exploration is much harder to most when you take 2 of them. Like exploiting, it's like improving, in a sense, like making more money with less efforts and resources. That makes sense. But exploration has so many unknowns, and most companies sometimes even don't know how to do it. It's not in their basic, you know, structure to do it.
And I've seen, you know, one of the areas where organisations traditionally, less so today, but in the past have really struggled is publicly listed companies, where there's an annual report and an annual shareholders meeting, and you get to stand up at the AGM and you get to ask questions of the board of directors, and you put yourself in a position there where the shareholder wants to see return, and the institutional investors, the pension fund or the retirement fund or the superannuation fund that owns sizable portions, are saying to the CEO and the CFO, where's our year-on-year return? And, you know, traditionally that was the question they were being asked. And so say, look, we weren't focusing on returns this year, we were focusing on experiments for something that might pay off a decade from now, tended to mean that the CEO and the CFO weren't there next year. So, you know, I think increasingly organisations recognise that without innovation, return year on year can't take place, and as a result, those questions are focused on in the annual general report and in the meetings and in the narrative that's created in the media. Because, you know, we've all seen, you know, the venture capital backed startup darlings of Silicon Valley and similar things coming out of Israel in, you know, Startup Nation. You know, we see the successes of those things, and as a result, there's some latitude for organisations to say, I want returns, but I also want innovation. Because if you're not showing me where the revenue is going to be in 15 years with your innovation program, then I'm going to look at my ownership of shares in this company as a short-term thing, because I'm going to diversify into somebody that I believe will be around in 15 years' time.
Yeah, and it's sometimes hard to show what you're saying, like to tell you now you need to invest something which is in the long run, and it's not as sure as doing what you're doing right now in the short run. So for the innovation leaders and people who try to change, they have a lot of work and to handle resistance in their organizations, actually.
Yeah, and having many experiments, you know, innovation has to be an innovation program that is trying all sorts of different things, internal, external, you know, small investment, medium investment, large investment, short-term returns, longer-term payoffs, because innovation by its very nature is uncertain. If it was certain, it wouldn't be called innovation, it'd be the business practice that you've got. So, you know, organizations have to expect a degree of failure. You know, and they have to embrace that failure and sort of say, you know, yeah, we failed, but we learned this, and this. We learned that this isn't for us. We learned that this piece of technology has potential, but we were using it the wrong way. You know, those kinds of things. And I think in some industries, there's also a role for industry bodies, for collaborative partnership with their supply chain partners, and also for governments to kind of forge innovation pathways or help co-fund adoption of innovation so that industries continue to modernise. Because otherwise, you know, you sort of find yourself in a situation where a country or a supply chain might be a dominant player, but governments tend to love the tax revenue that comes from powerful industries, but they need to be cognizant that the powerful industries won't stay around if they don't innovate. And if the governments, from a tax revenue perspective, benefit from their profits, then they should probably assist in reinvesting and helping them innovate and modernise and continue to be competitive on a global scale.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned before is the board and what they are looking for in the year-by-year revenues. And it seems that for me, when I think about the food industry, for me, it makes sense that who sits there are very, I know, established, experienced, older men who known the industry for so many years. And the diversity that is needed for the team to think about things differently is needed in the same way in the board, I guess.
Yeah, and Australia's similar to a lot of other places around the world. A lot of boards are unfortunately entirely populated by middle-aged white guys with university degrees who went to private schools. And as a result, they have the same ideas as each other, and that's not necessarily a great environment for innovation. I think from a board perspective, bringing in not necessarily board members, but external advisors, innovation consultants who have a voice at the boardroom table, who have an opportunity to give thought leadership into the boards to sort of say, this areas of disruption or areas of shifting consumer demand. Those sorts of things can have the board have their eyes opened, but the boards also need to recognise that they don't know what they know, and they're the ones that should be demanding from the CEO and the CFO that a certain level of effort from the organisation, be it labour or cost or consultants or whatever, is thrown towards innovation. And innovation comes from some phenomenal places in businesses. The internet's covered in stories of a subject matter expert in a small office or a far-flung remote office in an organisation comes up with an idea that truly changes things. So, I think that the board, it should be about preserving profitability and viability and being a cultural strong offering from a particular company. But board members should also have in mind that the organisation that grows and innovates and changes and becomes a better organisation in the decade while they're a board member and the decade after they finish being a board member, that's something to be proud of. And we need to look, at corporate incentives around those kind of changes, and shareholder ownership that overlaps with board tends to sort of be counteracting positive influences, but that's not across the board, but it is in some cases. And I think so long as there is an avenue for the board to demand but also fund and endorse innovation programs, then organisations that do that better than their competitors are going to come out better for it in the long run.
Yeah. So we mentioned a few factors that are obstacles to innovation. The fact that people are not really good at change and they don't want to change, the incentives and the processes within the company and the board and the pressure from the board, so on. But if I would ask you, what is the biggest obstacle to innovation, what would you say?
I think to some extent communication is a massive impact on innovation. If you tell people you're innovating, a lot of people say that sounds scary or risky or dangerous and I don't want to be involved. Whereas if you introduce somebody who is going to conduct a change program in a business, it sounds boring but acceptable. And so, to some extent, you might want to call it innovation or disruption in an innovation meeting. But if you're going to deliver to the rank and file in an organisation, helping them understand that this is a shift in operating model as endorsed from on high. The other thing about innovation, in terms of asking people to participate in innovation, is it is, and you touched on this earlier, Adi, it's perceived as risky because it is risky. There is no success. I think the critical aspect is letting people make mistakes, letting things be unsuccessful. Not only let them be unsuccessful, but celebrate the absence of success. Having the CEO stand up at a town hall for all of the 1,000 staff and say, here's this person from finance who had this innovative idea that we threw 20 grand at and it failed dismally, and I want to applaud them in front of all of you for bringing us new ideas and helping us grow and change and learn things, celebrating that attempt and that failure. Because it's really easy to throw that person 20 grand and 2 days a week for 6 months and to get them to try something. And then for the CEO to stand up at the town hall and go, it was a fabulous success and we made 20 million out of it. That's not leadership from a CEO. That's grandstanding, and it's patting yourself on the back for a success. I think a bigger, better CEO celebrates the lack of success and the learnings from it and the courage of the people to participate in it from the start. Because by encouraging people who fail or sharing, and fail's not the right word, but encouraging and sharing the learnings from something that wasn't successful, that encourages other people who might have a fabulous idea but are worried about the lack of success or the potential downside. So celebrating people for attempting something and rewarding them for that starts to shift that needle on a culture of innovation. Because if, I work in an organization of about 200 people. If we have 200 people out there that are throwing forward every conceivable idea that they've had, and every day when they go to work to do their job, they try to find an innovative way to improve our clients or our service offering or our own business, we can't help but be a better business. 2 years from now, we'll be a different business and we won't have even noticed the change. Whereas if innovation's left up to me with the fancy job title, I don't have the hours in the day to change how a 200-person company operates.
Sure. I think that's a great message, to celebrate the things that you were not successful in. And I heard a phrase a few days ago, it's either you win or you learn. So I think
Absolutely.
It's really, so
I tell my children that all the time because, in life we can't be successful. And, when you're at school or when you're playing basketball, when you're 10, it's acceptable to fail or to make a mistake or to lose. And I think at some point we unlearn that. We leave university or we leave school and we start a job and we don't want to make mistakes. And, we're still working 20 years later for a different organization, albeit, but we don't go to work saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter if I make a mistake. People are worried about their job security and they've got mortgages and school fees to pay and university debt or student loans that they're dealing with. And continuity of revenue from a personal perspective is a really, really important thing. So making it a safe place for people to try to improve our organizations, giving them that certainty that their efforts in making us a better organization or a more innovative, nimble organization that's prepared to change, rewarding and encouraging that. And when we do make a mistake, have a debrief, sit down and look at what did we learn, and then share those learnings. Because, there's no point in me talking to you about those learnings and then leaving 150 of my colleagues without that information for them to go and make the same mistake next week. Let's share that. Let's make sure no one makes those mistakes again.
Right. So I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been really insightful and the time passed so fast. Where could people hear more about your work? And I know that you're speaking, and just to contact you, where could they find you?
Sure, Addie. The easiest place is LinkedIn, and I'm sure that you can share that, or people can have a look at your LinkedIn profile and make their way to mine. I'm fairly sure I'm the only Brett Wiskar in LinkedIn spelt this way, and if I'm not, I'm the only one that's a Chief Future Officer. Alternatively, wiley.com.au is a good place to start, and my own website's brettwiskar.com. But reach out to me through LinkedIn. Happy to talk to other people about innovation. It's a passion of mine, obviously, given what I do for a living, and really keen to watch you talk to other innovators and learn from other people's experiences around the world as well, Addie.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And to all of you change makers out there, thank you for joining me. You're much welcome to invincibleinnovation.com and to our next episode. And I'll see you in a week. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Addie.